Thank you for joining us today. Hello, and welcome to From Lansing with Love. I'm your host, State Representative Leslie Love. Every month we discuss a different topic with interesting guests. I hope you find this program both informative and insightful. Mental health is a topic that has been on the news lately, and we are going to explore the state of mental health services in Michigan. Close to 5% of adults in Michigan live with serious mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. Yet less than half of those adults with mental illness in Michigan receive treatment from either the public system or private providers. Fewer things are more misunderstood than mental illness, and educating people about mental illness is a major goal of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, the nation's largest grassroots mental health organizations with chapters in every state and more than 1,100 local communities, including Michigan. We have with us today Kevin Fisher, the Executive Director of NAMI Michigan, who had a heart-wrenching journey to that position. Thank you for being here, Kevin, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I am so glad you're here. We are right now in the state of Michigan taking up bills that are commonly referred to as the Nassar bills. And to have someone who engaged and violated young people and young adults, while we're talking about these as sex crimes and child molesting, also there's probably some mental health issues and concerns around that. So I'm going to get into that, and we'll come back and touch. But I'm bringing that up to say this is really top on my mind right now because there's a lot going on around mental health, and sometimes, this conversation about sexual assault may also need to be a conversation about mental illness. But I want to start our conversation today with a little bit about the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And tell us about the organization. When was it founded?
So NAMI was founded in 1979, interestingly, around a kitchen table with a group of ladies who we proudly refer to as the NAMI mommies. There were a group of mothers who decided that their children weren't receiving services and mental health wasn't receiving the attention that it needed. And so they started as a small group called the Alliance on Mental Illness, and it morphed now into what is now known as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, as you mentioned, with over 1,100 affiliates across the country. I run the state office here in Lansing, and in the state of Michigan, we have 20 local affiliates in communities across the state. And those local communities, as a grassroots organization, they provide no-cost education, support, and advocacy for individuals who are affected by mental illness or their families and caregivers.
And how long have you been the executive director?
I've been the executive director for 4 years. I've been involved with NAMI for about 7 years now.
Wow. So I understand you have a very interesting story of how you came into the organization. What's your story?
So, like many people, most people don't think about mental illness until it affects them directly. For me, that is very true. My oldest son, Dominique, was diagnosed bipolar schizophrenic in 2007 when he was 20 years old. We had him in and out of treatment for approximately 3 years, and unfortunately, we lost him to suicide on June 27th of 2010. I came to NAMI actually looking for help from myself after losing my son. I wasn't aware of the organization. My wife literally found it for me on the internet as a way to help me cope with the grief. And so, like many NAMI members, I joined as a volunteer, and it kind of morphed into now being a full-time executive director position for me.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your son.
Thank you.
And in fact, I have lost a nephew and a niece to suicide. One was a freshman at Michigan State University, and my firstborn niece who committed suicide in '98. And I didn't know of the organization and what resources are available. Can you tell us what resources are available for surviving parents and siblings?
So, the great thing about NAMI is our strength is lived experience. So we offer a number of signature programs, again, that are at no cost to the participants, and it can be for people who are currently living with a mental health diagnosis, caring for someone who lived with a mental health diagnosis, or even somebody like myself who's lost a child. There are support programs that range from one called NAMI Basics, which is for adolescent children who are diagnosed with mental illness, and we have programs that you can participate in all the way through seniors, quite frankly. And they're all education and support. But again, the strength is they are all trained facilitators, but we have lived experience. So if you were to come to a NAMI program, say family to family, we would help you understand what the mental health diagnosis is, what it means, what the symptoms are, how you can help your child or your loved one, but also how you can help yourself, because one of the things that's missing is most people don't realize how emotionally and even physically exhausting it can be to be a caregiver of someone who's living with a mental health diagnosis. And unfortunately, I learned that firsthand with my adult son. It was exhausting at times.
Right. So there's two arms to this. The one that helps you, the person, or maybe there's multiple arms. The person who's suffering, their family unit, and then even afterwards, if someone has
If you've
passed
lost
away.
to suicide. And well, there's another component in advocacy. A large portion of my job as the state executive director, but of all of our members, is to advocate for better access to care, and that can be access for funding. We need more psychiatric beds. There are many facets to what we do, so it is ongoing.
Right. So let's explore that a little bit more. In recent history, you hear on the news about shootings at schools, and I'm doing a tour in the high schools and middle schools in my district, and there's a lot of emotion going on, and it's something very focused in this particular time, unlike even 2 years ago. Right now, the tensions are really high. Young people are stressed. I think it's a culture that's created from the national level, perhaps even some of the pressures that society, we microwave our kids. We want them to go to high school and college at the same time. We want you to know in the 7th grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? So, I mean, the kind of demands, like, hurry up and make a decision. So there are a lot of things that probably add in environment, economics. Is NAMI involved in schools? How do you engage young people who don't know where to go and say, I need some help, I need someone to talk to?
Oh, absolutely. Two of our most popular programs are aimed specifically at junior and senior high school age students. One of the programs is called NAMI Parents and Teachers as Allies, and that's where we work with school professionals, whether it's school teachers, counselors, administrators. It's an in-service day program for maybe an hour and a half, where we teach them how to identify students that may be experiencing a mental health crisis and connect them and their families to local mental health resources. Because one of the largest issues, and you'll hear me use the term stigma a lot, one of the largest issues with stigma is people aren't aware of what resources are available to them. Even though they're all around them, they don't see them. Which I find really interesting. The other program that we offer is called NAMI Ending the Silence, and it's an anti-stigma program to help students specifically understand that mental illness is like any other medical diagnosis. And if you wouldn't be ashamed to say, I've got a broken ankle or a cold or even cancer or something more serious, then you shouldn't be ashamed to say, I'm living with a mental health diagnosis and I can get help, and help them if they have a friend who may be experiencing a mental health crisis or maybe experiencing suicidal thoughts, how to help them help that person.
Right. Mr. Fisher, you said it's all around them, these services, but people don't see them.
Yes.
For our viewers' sake, help them. How would we identify it? How do we know it's around us?
So in metropolitan Detroit, in Redford, in your district, I drive around, and I know the Detroit-Wayne Mental Health Authority, for example, has billboards up all around metropolitan Detroit, up and down I-96. Almost everywhere I look, I see those billboards. But it is not at all uncommon for me to run into a metropolitan Detroiter and they will say, I've never seen one of those billboards. I have no idea that the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Authority exists. And quite frankly, the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Authority in particular is the fourth largest public mental health authority in the country, the largest in the state of Michigan, and with a budget of almost $750 million. So there are lots of resources available. Not that there's enough, because there's never enough, but there are lots of resources quite frankly, in the state. But most people aren't aware that they exist, and when they face a mental health crisis, they don't know who to call. They don't know who to pick up the phone and call. And again, I think that is in part because of the stigma. It's there, but we don't see it. It's as if we're blind to it because we're not thinking about it.
It's like, I don't need Wayne mental health. I need my pastor. Or, I need some prayer.
Well, you touch on a great topic because I was just speaking at a conference this weekend, and one of the touch points we have has to do with the issue of faith and mental health treatment because there are a lot of myths out there, but there are a lot of faith leaders, regardless as to your faith background, who will say mental illness is a curse, it's demonic, we pray it away. And I've talked to many faith leaders, and I said, well, do you feel the same about heart disease and cancer? Would you tell one of your members to not go to the doctor if they were experiencing symptoms of a heart attack? And if you wouldn't do that, then why would you tell them not to pursue mental health care as well? Because again, mental illness is a medical diagnosis. It's not a weakness. It's not something that you can just pray away, even though I'm a faithful person. I believe in the power of prayer. But I believe God gives us resources like doctors to help us on our daily journeys.
I agree. And I often thought, it wouldn't hurt if a person who was going into the ministry also had a degree in counseling, because people often will go and seek that advice or have someone on the staff that's a licensed therapist or a counselor, psychiatrist. It couldn't hurt, because I think that's a point of entry that, if you're working with schools, if you're working with Wayne County, working with the faith-based community would be another connection, because I'm sure they're looking like, well, who do I call?
Exactly. Well, and actually there is a coalition in metropolitan Detroit right now that was recently formed that does include members of the faith-based community because they realize what a crisis it is. And quite frankly, there's actually an increased need for mental health professionals among our faith leaders, because there has been an increase in suicides amongst faith leaders across many faiths, because faith leaders, as you mentioned before, don't necessarily have that training, but we bring all of our problems to them, and they take on sometimes more than they can handle as well.
All right. So we're going to continue the conversation after this break, and we're going to talk about access to education and how does someone become a therapist or certified to provide these type of services, and also the fact that we've had an extraordinarily long winter this year. So it's and how that may affect our mental well-being. So it's time for us to take a short break, and we'll be right back after this.
Many people are impacted by mental illness. Some people suffer depression or other treatable conditions. Many families are impacted by mental illness too. There's nothing to be afraid or ashamed of. There are many faces of mental illness, your neighbors, your friends. But like many diseases, mental illness is treatable, and most people who are diagnosed live healthy, productive lives. To learn more, go online to Michigan's National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org.
Welcome back to From Lansing with Love. We're here with Kevin Fisher, the Executive Director of NAMI Michigan. Again, thank you for being here, Mr. Fisher.
It's a pleasure.
So before the break, I mentioned we're having winter, the remix right now. It's extraordinarily long winter. I think it's because Easter came early, and so now we're all like, come on, I'm ready to get out here and plant and get in the garden or do whatever. But winter conditions can cause a lot of depression in people, or sadness, or a sense of melancholy, or or people just get weird, for lack of a better word. And like, I don't know why I feel like that, and not understand this is very normal, and you don't have to feel bad about what you're feeling. And you had mentioned stigma. What does weather and environment have to do with our mental illness?
So there is something called seasonal depression. And quite frankly, my wife does not like the winter. She would prefer to hibernate. And so, yeah, there are people who experience seasonal depression. Your environment plays a large role on your mental health situation. So whether it's weather, we were talking about earlier about children, your environment plays a large role in your mental well-being as well. We all experience trauma, whether it is in the home, in school with bullying, even with the young people who are a part of the Larry Nassar case. There is a mental health component to that was a traumatic event, something that we typically associate with maybe active service people or veterans with PTSD or post-traumatic traumatic stress syndrome. We experience that as well, and those traumas can trigger mental health crisis.
I imagine, even just like you said, environment, that if you live in a food desert, if you are very low income or live in abject poverty, that these are things that create an environment and a mental state of being that is not the most healthy.
No,
Would you say?
those are stressors that can trigger anxiety, can trigger depression, can trigger a lot of things. So yes, all of those are environmental factors that affect our mental health and our mental well-being, but also our physical well-being. We have to remember our brain is a part of our body, so being physically active, healthy diet, getting enough sleep. Sleep is the number one factor.
Yeah.
Things that we tend to overlook or take for granted play a very large role in our mental health well-being.
I'll tell you, Mr. Fisher, if I don't get good rest and some food, I am not a very nice person.
Neither
so
am I.
I don't know, but I have a little temporary, like, don't you mess with me. But I want to dive in a little bit deeper about the stigma of this. With the shootings that have happened across our nation and in schools, from high school and middle schools and elementary schools, and people are taking cover. And the American Psychiatric Association had a report that said it's just 1% of all yearly gun-related homicides are committed by people experiencing serious mental illness. So why does mental illness continue to be blamed to gun violence or associated with that?
There are several factors. One, I believe very strongly, has to do with how the media chooses to cover these acts. So we've determined that maybe we know under 4% of all gun violence is perpetrated by persons who've been diagnosed with a mental illness. So where does the other 96% come from? It's not just the guns. It's not just mental illness. It's both. And mental illness and guns absolutely do not mix. They should not. If we look back to the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, the young man, Adam Lanza, I believe was his name, his mother regularly took him to a gun range. The American sniper, who was helping one of his veteran friends who was experiencing PTSD, took him to a gun range and was killed by that person at the gun range. Guns and mental illness don't mix, but persons who live with a mental health diagnosis are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, because most, like my son who was diagnosed bipolar schizophrenic, most just want to be left alone. Most are not looking to hurt anyone. But untreated mental illness is a crisis in this country. And when I talk to law enforcement officials across the state, that seems to be the number one concern that they have. So I'm trying to make the distinction that most people who live with a mental health diagnosis are not dangerous to society. However, we need to focus on resources for untreated mental illness so we can get the people who need the help the help that they need.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I recently went through training to receive my CPL. And there's a long form that you have to fill out and things I can't do. It's very extensive to be able to carry concealed pistol. And I thought, if I had a mental illness, but I was still an avid hunter, or I just like to my firearms. I go to the range. I would never go to the doctor, because now you would think somehow this part of me is associated with that part. And sometimes it's just people who are popping off very angry. They don't know how to, not necessarily have mental illness, but have the inability to separate my rage from the person, and now I have this to solve the problem. Has nothing to do with being bipolar or schizophrenic, but someone in the heat of passion or angry reacting out.
I think you are 100% correct. And I think, unfortunately, in this political climate we live in, it's easy to blame people who have been diagnosed with a mental illness, or to even assume that a person who perpetrates, let's say, the Las Vegas shooting, it's easy to say, well, that person had to be mentally ill to carry out that act. Not necessarily.
Right.
Like you said, there are some people who impulsively carry out acts of violence because they don't know how to control their rage. That doesn't mean that they were mentally ill, and that mentally ill people should, that should be put on the people who live with legitimately diagnosed mental illness. It's not fair, and it's part of the stigma when, again, the issue is twofold. It's guns, and how do we keep them out of the hands of people who will do bad things, and it's making sure we have access to mental health care for people who need it. We should have a national registry for persons who live with a mental health diagnosis. That is probably not a good idea for them to have access to guns at that time. The interesting question becomes, at what point, or how do we have that person evaluated, or maybe that they've gotten better and maybe their doctor says they can have access to a gun again. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't know how to make that determination.
You don't think that having a registry helps with the stigma? Because I mean, if you know you're going to be on this registry and everyone knows I'm certified, whatever the diagnosis is, that's a part of why people would shy away from seeking help.
I don't think it affects the stigma, and here's the reason why. Because stigma is kind of a falsehood. It's the assumption that a person is weak, but I think with a clear medical diagnosis, if I am diagnosed schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic or something like that, and my doctor, my psychiatrist says at this time Kevin Fisher should not have access to guns, then I would want to be put on that registry. I know that sounds like, would he really say that because he doesn't really have to live with it today? But for the safety of society, I don't think that's stigmatizing. I think that's taking care of our community. And if that doctor, again, at some point down the road said, Kevin is better and his health condition is under control and he's an avid hunter and he should be able to go hunt again, then I think that's a determination for the doctors to make.
So I'm on the border with that, because I don't, I wouldn't I think it's important that there are some people who are diagnosed that should not have access, but there are also many individuals that are not diagnosed, who could just be angry, who are seeking retaliation. There's no way to identify that. But and what's I think is even more important is that we work on creating a culture, like you said earlier, that it's okay.
Yeah.
To say mental health is just as common as saying I have cancer or my sister had cancer, and that people can seek that help.
Well, and again, I absolutely agree with you. I don't want anyone to be stigmatized. I don't want anyone to be labeled. But I think it's important that we make sure our communities are safe. And I'll give you a very quick example. I had a gentleman call into a radio show I was on about 2 years ago, and he was schizophrenic. And he did say the voices in his head was telling him to kill himself. The voices in his head was telling him to harm members of his family. Now, this gentleman gratefully had the wherewithal to say, I know this is not right. And he recalled knocking on his mother's door at 2 o'clock in the morning, telling her, please take this gun away from me because the voices in my head are telling me to do something I know is not right. Those are the people who I'm thinking of when I say there should be a registry, and it should be a responsible registry. It should be managed by doctors who say at this time, Kevin Fisher shouldn't have access to guns, and I'm okay with that.
Yes. Okay. So do we have enough healthcare professionals in this industry to service the need?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. What's the barriers to that?
Part of that is stigma. I've spoken to many psychiatrists, social workers, who tell me when they're in school, there are other medical students who maybe be specializing in cardiology or something, who will tell a psychologist student, well, you're not a real doctor. That's not real. So there's a stigma within the profession itself. But we need so many more. There's a tremendous shortage in Michigan, but there's a tremendous shortage nationally for behavioral health professionals. And quite frankly, in many regards, you can make a pretty good living at it. So it's not just the money. But yes, there's a tremendous shortage.
Wow. We're definitely on the state level maybe need to look at that. I don't know how long it takes to earn a degree or get your certification, but if there's a way to make sure that we have well-trained people that can get those skills that they need so they can go out and service the client base, because we want to make sure we have a healthy Michigan, physically and mentally, right?
Absolutely. Well, and as you mentioned in your introduction, there are about 300,000 people who receive public mental health services in Michigan, but we know nationally only about 40% of people who need mental health care receive it. So again, you can double that number and say there's probably 600,000 to 700,000 people in need of public mental health services.
All right. Well, Mr. Fisher, we're about out of time, but anything else you can share with our audience about the National Alliance of Mental Illness, where they, how you can be accessed, and anything else you want to share?
NAMI is a predominantly volunteer organization, and we welcome anyone who has any interest in mental health care. We also welcome professionals. Professionals sometimes don't get involved at the grassroots level, but we really need them as well. And I would simply urge the listening public to understand that mental illness is not a personal weakness. It is a medical diagnosis. If you or somebody you love is experiencing a mental health crisis, don't be afraid or ashamed to get help, because our motto is recovery is possible. And there are many, many examples in our communities of people who have learned to live very normal, productive lives and manage their mental health needs.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time. I could talk to you for another hour, half an hour, but I want to say this in closing. Before coming to the legislature, I worked in theater. And one of the beautiful things about the arts is that it has always been a place for people to express themselves, even to get out some emotions. And so whether that's through painting or music. In fact, before the show started, we talked about the music I was jamming driving into work today to kind of set the mood and the tone for me. And so how the arts can play out in this. But in the theater, I'm very much aware of emotions. We emote for a living. And so we create and allow a safe space to feel love, to feel anxiety, to feel sadness, to feel confusion, to have all of that be felt.
Art, music, theater, all of those things lend themselves to improving your mental health state. So we absolutely encourage them. We are absolutely connected to them, whether, again, art, music, whatever there be. They are they're very good ways of managing your mental health.
Right. And so I bring that up to let folks know when Mr. Fisher says we're looking for volunteers, people at the grassroots level. You don't have to be an expert or a psychologist. You can be a quilter. You can be an artist. You can be a person with a loved one who's suffering, or just because you are an empathetic ear and you want to make a difference in the community. So that's about all the time we have today. I'd like to once again thank my guest, Kevin Fisher, the Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness Michigan, for joining us. And thanks to all of you for watching. If you have an idea for a show, please contact my office, and that contact information will be on the screen. Until next time, be good to yourself and each other. And with that, we're all clear and out of here.